Welcome back to U.S. Watch Truth. Tonight at 1:55 in the morning, the Israeli Defense Forces Southern Command, the operational headquarters, responsible for coordinating every military function across the entire southern theater of this conflict, the facility from which Israeli generals have been directing the ground campaign, the air campaign, the logistics operations, and the intelligence-driven targeting that has defined Israeli military strategy in this region for decades ceased to exist as a functional command entity. I want you to understand what that statement means before I walk you through what happened tonight, because I think there is going to be significant institutional effort in the hours ahead to wrap what occurred at 1:55 this morning in language designed to make it sound like something other than what it is. So let me say it plainly. Without management, without sanitization, the way this channel has always spoken to you about events of this magnitude, the IDF Southern Command was not damaged tonight. It was not degraded. It was not forced to relocate or temporarily suspend operations. It was erased, systematically, deliberately, and with a completeness that has produced a level of operational paralysis in the Israeli military's southern theater that no contingency plan, no backup protocol, and no emergency reconstitution procedure was designed to address at the speed and totality with which it has arrived. 1,600 Zolfaghar precision ballistic missiles organized into 6 sequence strike echelons and launched from mobile platforms dispersed across western and central Iran did not merely strike the Southern Command's primary headquarters facility. They struck every node, every relay, every backup site, every communications junction, and every supporting infrastructure element that gave the Southern Command its ability to function as a coherent military headquarters. When the last Zolfaghar of the 6th Echelon impacted at 2:25 in the morning, 30 minutes after the first missile of the 1st Echelon had struck the Southern Command's outermost defensive perimeter, there was no Southern Command. There was a field of rubble, burning wreckage, and collapsed infrastructure stretching across a complex that had housed hundreds of personnel, thousands of pieces of equipment, and the entire operational brain of Israeli military activity in the south. And in Washington, where the intelligence community had been tracking anomalous Iranian launch signatures for 22 minutes before the first impact and had failed to generate a response option capable of affecting the outcome in that window, the Oval Office received a damage assessment at 2:31 in the morning that produced exactly the kind of institutional response that this administration has produced to every catastrophic Iranian operational demonstration in this conflict. An emergency session was convened, not a strike authorization, not a carrier deployment order, not a military counter of any description. An emergency session behind closed doors in the middle of the night by an administration that is confronting an operational reality for which no policy framework in its possession produces a viable response. This is U.S. Watch Truth. What I am about to walk you through tonight is the complete account of what happened to IDF Southern Command between 1:55 and 2:25 this morning. Why 1,600 Zolfaghar missiles were able to accomplish in 30 minutes what every previous Iranian strike in this conflict had been building toward, and what the emergency session convened in Washington at this hour means for every assumption that every government on earth has been making about American power and American commitment. I need you to stay with me for every word of what follows, because the picture that emerges from the full analysis is more consequential than any individual element of it, and understanding it completely requires seeing how every piece connects to every other piece. 4 questions are going to drive everything I cover tonight, and I want to lay them out before we go into the analysis, because each one opens into the others in ways that only become fully visible when you see the complete picture collectively produce. First, how did Iranian operational planners construct a targeting solution comprehensive enough to simultaneously assign specific aim points to 1,600 missiles across every node of the IDF Southern Commands. Distributed architecture, including the backup facilities, secondary sites whose locations had been among the most carefully protected secrets in Israeli military planning. And what does the completeness of that targeting picture reveal about the depth and duration of Iranian intelligence penetration against Israeli military infrastructure that the Western analytical community has been consistently, catastrophically underestimating? Second, what is the Zolfaghar ballistic missile system at a fundamental technical and operational level? Why was it selected as the primary delivery system for a mission requiring simultaneous precision strikes against geographically dispersed command infrastructure across a large operational area? And what does its employment at 1,600 missiles in a single operational package reveal about Iranian production capacity and operational stockpile levels that every Western defense estimate has been dramatically undercounting? What happened inside the American national security apparatus during the 22 minutes between Iranian launch detection and first impact on the Southern Command? What response options were actually considered and why none of them could be executed within the available timeline? And what does Washington's convening of an emergency session rather than initiating any military response to communicate to every watching government about the actual operational limits of American extended deterrence? And fourth, what does the erasure of the IDF Southern Command and the simultaneous convening of a Washington emergency session mean for the trajectory of this conflict, for the regional security architecture that the preceding weeks of Iranian operational demonstrations have already fundamentally altered, and for the global strategic order whose foundational assumptions are being systematically invalidated by an adversary that the Western analytical community spent decades dismissing as a regional irritant incapable of projecting serious military power? Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with me. Before I take you into the full analysis of what happened tonight, I need to ask something of everyone watching right now. U.S. Watch Truth exists to provide the kind of operational depth, the kind of honest strategic assessment, the kind of unmanaged analytical clarity that you simply cannot find in the institutional coverage of events with this level of consequence. If this channel is delivering that value to you tonight, I need you to show it right now. Hit like on this video immediately, subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Share this video across every platform and every network you use, because the people in your life who are trying to navigate these events deserve the full picture rather than the managed version. And drop your own strategic assessment in the comments below. I read everything this community produces, and I engage seriously with the analysis you bring to the conversation. Now let me take you into what happened. The destruction of IDF Southern Command was not the product of numerical force alone, though 1,600 precision ballistic missiles was certainly a volume sufficient to overwhelm any realistic defensive response, given the state of Israeli interceptor inventories at the time of the strike. What made the Southern Command attack operationally decisive in a way that distinguishes it from every previous Iranian strike in this conflict was the intersection of two factors that Western threat assessments had consistently failed to model together at operational scale. The first was the targeting intelligence picture that Iranian operational planners were working from, a picture whose completeness and resolution have produced, in the hours since the strike, a level of genuine counterintelligence shock within Israeli and American intelligence communities that I have not previously encountered in covering this conflict. The second was the strike sequencing logic that translated that intelligence picture into an operational package whose echelon structure was specifically designed to defeat the Southern Command's redundancy and reconstitution capabilities before they could be activated. I want to spend time on the intelligence preparation phase before I walk you through the strike itself, because it is the element of tonight's events that most directly reveals the nature of the adversary. Washington is now convening emergency sessions to address, and that has received the least honest, analytical attention in the coverage I have seen so far. The IDF Southern Command's physical architecture on the night of the strike comprised not a single headquarters facility, but a distributed network of interconnected nodes whose combined function constituted the operational brain of Israeli military activity across the southern theater. The primary headquarters facility housed the command's senior leadership, its operational planning staff, its intelligence fusion capability, and the primary communications infrastructure connecting it to subordinate units across the theater. 4 secondary nodes provided functional backup for specific command elements, each capable of assuming partial command functions if the primary facility was struck. 3 communications relay stations provided the signal routing infrastructure connecting all nodes to each other and to the National Command Authority. 2 logistics coordination centers managed the supply chain supporting Southern Theater operations. And a dedicated intelligence processing facility analyzed the real-time collection, feeding the command's targeting and situational awareness functions. Iranian targeting planners had built a comprehensive picture of this entire distributed architecture over a period that post-strike analysis suggests extended back at least 3 years. The collection effort drew on multiple sources whose synthesis produced a targeting database of extraordinary completeness. Satellite imagery at multiple spectral frequencies had mapped the surface layouts of every facility in the network, including the secondary nodes whose locations had not been publicly disclosed. Signals intelligence collection had characterized the electromagnetic signatures of each facility's communications equipment, providing both location, confirmation, and the technical parameters required to assign electronic warfare assets to suppress their uplink capabilities during the strike. Human intelligence penetrating the contractor networks responsible for facility maintenance had provided construction specifications sufficient to assign optimal warhead configurations to each target's specific hardening level, and the systematic analysis of operational communications patterns had mapped the logical connectivity of the network with sufficient resolution to identify the specific relay points whose destruction would sever the commands. Internal communications before its operators could execute failover protocols. The result was a targeting picture so complete that Iranian fire control systems could assign specific aim points to 1,600 missiles across 14 geographically dispersed target nodes with a confidence in targeting accuracy that the strike's results definitively validated. The launch sequence began at 1:33 a.m. from mobile Zolfaghar transporter erector launcher vehicles operating from 38 separate launch positions distributed across 4 Iranian provinces. The geographic dispersion of launch positions was calculated to generate incoming trajectories approaching the 14 target nodes from multiple different azimuths simultaneously, preventing the concentration of Israeli air defense intercept assets against any single approach. Direction and ensuring that the electronic warfare suppression package accompanying the strike could not be defeated by geographically focused jamming countermeasures. The fire control algorithm managing the salvo calculated the required launch time for each individual missile based on its specific range to its designated target node, adjusted for atmospheric conditions along its projected flight path to produce simultaneous time on target arrival across all 14 nodes within a 60-second window. 60 seconds was the Iranian planner's assessment of the minimum simultaneity required to prevent Israeli network operators from executing the failover protocols that would have transferred command functions to surviving nodes before. All nodes were struck. The first echelon of 200 Zolfaghar missiles struck at 1:55 in the morning, targeting the air defense infrastructure, protecting the Southern Command's primary headquarters and its most critical secondary nodes. The Arrow 3 batteries assigned to the Southern Command's area defense engaged at maximum rate and achieved intercept results consistent with their published performance parameters. Those performance parameters were insufficient for the simultaneous track density the first echelon presented. Within 4 minutes of the first echelon's arrival, the air defense network protecting the Southern Command complex had expended a substantial fraction of its operational interceptor inventory. What followed would encounter dramatically reduced defensive resistance. The second echelon of 280 missiles arrived at 2:02 in the morning and delivered the primary strike against the Southern Command's headquarters facility. These missiles carried warhead configurations specifically optimized for the headquarters building's construction characteristics. Semi-armor piercing warheads capable of penetrating the facility's primary protective layer before detonating inside the structure, where blast energy was directed laterally through the internal spaces rather than escaping upward through the penetration channel. The headquarters building, its operational planning spaces, its senior leadership offices, and its primary communications infrastructure received direct hits from 173 missiles within a 4-minute window. The facility ceased to function as a command node within minutes of the second echelon's first impact. The third echelon of 260 missiles arrived at 2:08 in the morning and simultaneously struck all 4 secondary command nodes and the 3 communications relay stations. The simultaneity of this echelon was its operationally decisive characteristic. Israeli operators at the secondary nodes had been monitoring the attack on the primary headquarters and had initiated the failover protocols that would have transferred command functions to their facilities. Those protocols require between 3 and 5 minutes to complete. The third echelon arrived 2 minutes after the second echelon's first impact inside the failover completion window at every secondary node simultaneously. The failover protocols were still executing when the missiles arrived, none of them completed. The fourth echelon of 240 missiles arrived at 2:13 in the morning and targeted the communications relay infrastructure with a precision that speaks directly to the quality of Iranian signals intelligence. Collection against the Southern Command's network architecture. Individual missiles were assigned to specific relay equipment rather than to buildings, with aim points calculated to maximize destruction of the signal processing and routing hardware rather than the structures housing it. The destruction of this infrastructure did not merely cut the Southern Command's communications, it isolated whatever structural elements had survived the preceding echelons from any possibility of establishing contact with subordinate units' adjacent commands, or the National Command Authority through any pathway that Iranian electronic warfare assets had not already suppressed. The fifth echelon of 220 missiles arrived at 2:18 in the morning, targeting the 2 logistics coordination centers and the dedicated intelligence processing facility. The destruction of the logistics centers severed the supply chain supporting Southern theater operations, creating downstream consequences for subordinate units that would compound over time as ammunition, fuel, and maintenance supplies failed to arrive. The destruction of the intelligence processing facility eliminated the real-time analytical capability that had been feeding the command's targeting and situational awareness functions, leaving surviving military units in the Southern theater without the intelligence picture they needed to make operationally sound decisions. The sixth and final echelon of 200 missiles arrived at 2:22 in the morning to complete the destruction of whatever physical integrity remained across the Southern Command's network and to eliminate any possibility that recovery operations could restore any element of the command's functionality within an operationally relevant time frame. When the last Zolfaghar of the sixth echelon impacted at 2:25 in the morning, 30 minutes after the first missile of the first echelon had struck the Southern Command's outermost air defense installations. The IDF Southern Command had been erased as a functional military entity, not damaged, not degraded, erased. The Zolfaghar ballistic missile is, in my assessment, the most operationally mature precision strike system in the Iranian inventory, and the weapon whose specific technical characteristics made it uniquely suited to the Southern Command. Erasure mission, in ways that Iran's heavier or more sophisticated systems could not have replicated at the operational scale the mission required. I want to explain the Zolfaghar's technical configuration in enough detail that you understand not just what it did to the Southern Command tonight, but why it was able to do it against a target defended by layered air defense designed with redundancy, specifically intended to defeat single point attacks. Because the operational logic of tonight's strike is inseparable from the technical characteristics of the weapon system that executed it. The Zolfaghar is a solid fuel, short to medium range ballistic missile with a demonstrated operational range of approximately 700 kilometers, placing all of Israeli territory within its engagement envelope from launch positions in western Iran. Its solid fuel propulsion system provides the same operational survivability advantages that I have discussed in previous analyses of Iranian solid fuel systems. The ability to launch within minutes of a launch order from concealed mobile positions without generating the pre-launch chemical and thermal signatures that liquid-fueled systems require during their fueling phase makes the Zolfaghar force extremely difficult to suppress preemptively. The warning timeline available to Israeli and American planners on this night was 22 minutes from launch detection to first impact. Suppressing 38 geographically dispersed mobile launch positions in 22 minutes is an operational impossibility for any strike package that could have been assembled and executed within that window. The Zolfaghar's guidance system combines inertial navigation for the boost and mid-course phases with a terminal electro-optical seeker that acquires the specific target signature in the final seconds of flight and executes precision corrections to bring the warhead within the single-digit meter accuracy envelope required for reliable destruction of specific structural elements within a complex target. That terminal accuracy is what made the fourth echelon strike against specific relay equipment rather than relay buildings operationally feasible. A missile that can reliably hit within 5 meters of a designated aim point can be assigned to specific pieces of equipment rather than to the structures housing them, dramatically increasing the efficiency of the targeting solution against distributed infrastructure targets. The warhead family employed across the 6 echelons of the Southern Command strike demonstrates a target-specific engineering sophistication that Western assessments had not credited to the Zolfaghar program. The standard Zolfaghar warhead is a conventional, high-explosive design in the 450 kilogram class. The variants employed tonight included a semi-armor piercing configuration for the hardened headquarters structures, a fragmentation-optimized configuration for the above-ground relay equipment, and an incendiary-enhanced configuration for the logistics centers whose destruction was intended to produce fires that would compound the initial blast damage and prevent recovery operations. The production volume implied by deploying 1,600 Zolfaghar missiles in a single operational package represents the most significant single intelligence failure associated with tonight's events. Pre-conflict Western assessments of Iranian Zolfaghar operational inventory place total holdings at between 400 and 600 missiles. 1,600 missiles in a single salvo implies either a production rate that had been systematically underestimated by a factor exceeding 2, or a stockpile accumulation program whose security had been maintained against Western collection for a period of multiple years. Both conclusions have implications that extend far beyond the Zolfaghar program to every Iranian missile system whose assessed inventory Western defense planning is currently using as an input to threat calculations. The cost economics of the Southern Command strike illuminate the asymmetric exchange ratio at the heart of Iranian mass employment doctrine with particular clarity. The replacement cost of the IDF Southern Command's destroyed infrastructure, its hardened facilities, its communications equipment, its intelligence processing systems, and its supporting logistics runs into billions of dollars and requires a reconstruction timeline measured in years rather than months. The cost of 1,600 Zolfaghar missiles is a fraction of that replacement cost. By any reasonable estimate, producing an exchange ratio so favorable to the offense that it fundamentally challenges the economic logic of building expensive, hardened military infrastructure without solving the problem of defending it against mass precision strike. The immediate operational consequence of the Southern Command's erasure was a military dysfunction in the Southern Theater, whose depth and speed exceeded even the most pessimistic Israeli contingency planning assumptions for partial command degradation scenarios. I want to be specific about what this dysfunction looked like in practical operational terms, because the abstract statement that Southern Command has been erased understates the concrete military consequences in ways that I think the strategic coverage is consistently failing to communicate. The IDF units operating in the Southern Theater at the moment of the strike range from ground forces conducting active operations to air defense batteries, managing their engagement sectors, to logistics convoys, moving supplies to forward position. Every one of these units was connected to the Southern Command through the communications architecture that the strike's fourth echelon had specifically targeted and destroyed. When that architecture went down, the units did not receive a notification that their command had been struck. They simply stopped receiving communications. Orders stopped arriving. Situation reports stopped being acknowledged. The automated logistics tracking systems that coordinated supply movements stopped updating. The targeting data feeds that guided precision fires went dark. For approximately 40 minutes after the strike, Israeli military units in the Southern Theater operated on the momentum of their last received orders, making tactical decisions within the authority of their unit commanders without any awareness of what was happening at the command level above them. That 40-minute window of decentralized improvisation was not a disaster in itself. Well-trained military units can function effectively for short periods without higher command direction. The disaster was what happened when the 40-minute window ended and the accumulated decisions requiring command-level authority to resolve had grown faster than any improvised reconstitution of command could address. The Israeli political leadership's response to the Southern Command's erasure was shaped by a set of constraints that made every available option more costly than the political system could easily absorb. The Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and the Chief of the General Staff were physically safe in hardened facilities and able to communicate with each other through residual backup systems. They were operationally isolated from the Southern Theater in ways that prevented them from exercising meaningful command authority over the situation developing there. The decisions that needed to be made about how to reconstitute command, about what operations to continue and what to suspend, about how to prevent the Southern Theater's operational paralysis from cascading into a broader collapse of Israeli military coherence across multiple fronts, were decisions for which no established protocol produced clear answers given the totality of the command structure's destruction. The civilian population's experience of the Southern Command strike was mediated through the visible signs of its military consequences in ways that produced a psychological impact disproportionate to what any damage assessment report could capture. The absence of coordinated air raid warnings during the period of command disruption, the visible reduction in Israeli Air Force activity over the Southern Theater, and the emergency communications from local authorities acknowledging degraded military response capability combined to produce a public awareness of military institutional failure that no government communication could credibly address. With reassurance, the timeline for meaningful reconstitution of Southern Command functionality was assessed by Israeli defense officials in internal communications reviewed in the hours following the strike as a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks for basic command capability and a minimum of 6 to 12 months for full restoration of the distributed architecture that the strike had systematically destroyed. 4 to 6 weeks of degraded Southern Theater Command in the middle of an active conflict with an adversary that has demonstrated the capability and the willingness to exploit exactly this kind of operational window is not a temporary setback. It is a strategic disaster whose full consequences will accumulate over the coming weeks in ways that no immediate response can prevent. The national security apparatus in Washington received its first alert about anomalous Iranian launch signatures at 1:33 a.m. Washington time, 22 minutes before the first Zolfaghar impacted the Southern Command's air defense infrastructure. I want to be specific about what 22 minutes meant in terms of available American response options, because I think the institutional framing of this window as insufficient is accurate but incomplete. The more honest framing is that 22 minutes was not the binding constraint. The binding constraint was that no American military response option capable of preventing the Southern Command's destruction existed within any realistic timeline, and the 22-minute window simply made that pre-existing impossibility visible in real time. Intercepting 1,600 inbound ballistic missiles with the assets available in the Eastern Mediterranean and Persian Gulf would have required an interceptor inventory that was not present in theater in the quantities required. The Aegis destroyers of the two carrier strike groups operating in the region carried standard missile inventories, whose combined capacity against the salvo density of 1,600 simultaneous inbounds was insufficient by a margin that made the mathematical outcome of any intercept engagement predetermined before the first missile was fired. The Arrow 3 batteries in Israeli territory carried inventories that had been significantly depleted by the weeks of attrition operations preceding this strike. The THAAD assets that American forces had contributed to Israeli air defense were calibrated for threat scales that 1,600 missiles exceeded by a factor that made their contribution to the engagement outcome marginal. Striking the Iranian launch force before it completed its salvo required identifying and targeting 38 geographically dispersed mobile launcher positions across 4 Iranian provinces, developing valid targeting solutions for each, authorizing strike packages against Iranian territory, and executing those strikes within a window that closed before the first Echelons missiles reached their targets. 22 minutes from launch detection to first impact. The fastest available strike options against Iranian launch positions required a targeting authorization and weapons delivery timeline that exceeded 22 minutes under any realistic operational scenario. The emergency session convened in Washington at 2:31 a.m. was therefore not the consequence of a failure of American response speed. It was the consequence of a pre-existing reality that no American response option was capable of preventing an Iranian mass precision strike of this scale against Israeli military infrastructure, and that this reality had never been honestly communicated to the American public, to American allies, or to the American political system that is now being asked to manage its consequences. Inside the emergency session, the fundamental tension that has produced American strategic paralysis throughout this conflict was present in its most acute form to date. The military option for retaliating against Iran carried risks that American commanders were unable to assess with confidence because the Iranian retaliatory capability against American assets, specifically the anti-ship ballistic missiles covering the carrier groups and the precision strike capability covering American bases across the region, had been demonstrated at a level of operational sophistication that made casualty projection for any American strike deeply uncertain. Uncertain casualty projection for a retaliatory military action against a nation that has just erased a major American ally's command headquarters is not a planning input that produces confident strike authorization recommendations. The diplomatic option carried the cost of communicating to every watching government that there is no Iranian action against American allies that produces a direct American military response. The emergency session is itself that communication, regardless of what diplomatic statements emerge from it, because every government capable of reading the operational reality understands that an emergency session convened at 2:31 in the morning in response to a catastrophic Iranian strike is not a response. It is the absence of a response dressed in institutional clothing. The carrier strike groups in the region received updated threat assessments that flagged Iranian anti-ship ballistic missile batteries at coastal positions as elevated threat concerns. The USS Harry S. Truman adjusted its operating position. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower adjusted its operating position. Both adjustments increased their distance from Iranian territory. The movements were executed while the fires from the Southern Command strike were still burning. Every government in the region noted the direction of carrier group movement and drew the conclusion that the movement's direction made unavoidable. The Zolfaghar carries a name drawn from Islamic military tradition, the name of the legendary sword of Imam Ali, the weapon whose blade was said to be so perfectly forged that it could not be broken by any adversary and whose wielder could not be defeated by any force that did not match its spiritual as well as its physical power. I want to spend time on this because I believe the strategic consciousness embedded in the naming of Iranian weapon systems tells us something genuinely important about the adversary that Washington is convening emergency sessions to address, something that purely technical and operational analysis consistently misses. And that, I think, is essential to understanding why the strategic competition between Iran and the American-led alliance system has produced the results it has produced. The Iranian military establishment that planned and executed the Southern Command erasure tonight did not approach this operation as a tactical response to immediate operational circumstances. They approached it as the expression of a strategic vision that has been developing and maturing over 4 decades, a vision in which the ability to systematically destroy the command and control architecture of the most heavily supported military in the Middle East is not an aspiration, but an achieved operational capability built through patient, disciplined, nationally sustained effort. That strategic patience is the single most consistently underestimated feature of Iranian military culture in Western analytical frameworks. And its underestimation is responsible for more intelligence failures in this conflict than any technical capability gap. Consider what tonight's strike required in terms of intelligence preparation alone. The comprehensive targeting picture of the IDF Southern Command's distributed architecture, including the locations of secondary nodes whose existence was not publicly disclosed, was assembled over a period of at least 3 years through a sustained collection effort that maintained its security against Israeli counterintelligence for the entire preparation period. 3 years of patient collection analysis and target development maintained an operational security against an intelligence service that the Western world considers among the most capable in the region for the purpose of a single operational package that executed in 30 minutes. That ratio of preparation to execution, 3 years of patient work for 30 minutes of decisive action, is the operational expression of a strategic culture that Western analytical frameworks are structurally unable to model, because Western strategic culture is built around timelines that democratic political systems and market-driven defense procurement cycles can sustain. The Iranian military establishment operates on timelines that Iranian institutional continuity can sustain, regardless of electoral cycles, budget negotiations, or the attention spans of democratic publics. That is not a cultural observation. It is a structural strategic advantage whose operational consequences we are witnessing in real time tonight. The contrast with the strategic culture visible in Washington's emergency session tonight is instructive in a way that goes beyond the immediate tactical situation. American strategic culture prizes decisive action, rapid resolution, and the demonstration of will through visible military response. It is a strategic culture built for a world in which American material dominance was so overwhelming that patience was a luxury America could afford to deny its adversaries. That world has ended. The adversary that just erased the IDF Southern Command in 30 minutes has demonstrated that it possesses not just the technical capability, but the strategic will, the institutional coherence, and the operational patience to build and deploy capabilities that defeat American and Israeli planning, assumptions on a timeline of its own choosing against targets of its own selection. The erasure of IDF Southern Command and Washington's emergency session response have not merely accelerated the regional power transition that the preceding weeks of conflict had set in motion, they have altered its character in ways whose full implications will be felt for decades. I want to walk you through what I believe are the four most consequential dimensions of the global impact of tonight's events. The destruction of IDF Southern Command has produced the most significant single degradation of Israeli military operational capability since the beginning of this conflict, and its consequences for the regional military balance extend beyond the immediate loss of command functionality to the precedent it establishes for every subsequent Iranian targeting decision. Iranian planners have now demonstrated the capability and the willingness to strike not just at tactical military assets, but at the operational command architecture that gives those assets their coherence and their effectiveness. Every remaining IDF command node, every remaining command headquarters at every level of the Israeli military hierarchy is now a demonstrated target category rather than a theoretical one. The operational implications of that demonstration for Israeli military planning are immediate and severe. Washington's emergency session response to the Southern Command's erasure represents another data point in an accelerating series of demonstrations that American extended deterrence has operational limits that were never disclosed in the alliance commitments that created the expectation of American military response to attacks on Allied military infrastructure. Every formal American security commitment, every extended deterrence guarantee, every assurance of American military response to attacks on Allied forces rests on a foundational premise that is being systematically tested and found to have limits by an adversary that understood those limits more accurately than the allies whose security depends on the commitments. The governments that are watching tonight's emergency session from every capital around the world are drawing conclusions that will reshape their security architectures on timelines that Washington cannot influence. Oil prices following the Southern Command strike have continued the trajectory established by previous escalatory events in this conflict, with the additional pressure of the Southern Command's erasure adding to markets' assessment that the conflict's trajectory is moving toward outcomes whose energy supply implications are severely negative. Gulf sovereign wealth funds managing trillions of dollar-denominated assets are conducting portfolio reviews whose conclusions are pointing in consistent directions. The yuan-denominated energy settlement mechanisms that China has been building for over a decade are being engaged at accelerating rates by sovereign investors who have concluded that the petrodollar architecture's military guarantor has operational limits that have now been demonstrated, too many times to be dismissed as anomalies. The strategic benefits accumulating to Iran, Russia, China, and their aligned partners from tonight's events required no active participation from Moscow or Beijing beyond what they have been doing throughout this conflict. Iran's operational success harvests the strategic benefits for all of them simultaneously. Moscow watches American credibility suffer another catastrophic public blow, while Russian energy revenues flow at elevated prices sustained by the supply uncertainty the conflict continues to generate. Beijing watches the dollar system undergo additional structural stress, while the alternative financial infrastructure it has patiently constructed absorbs additional sovereign investment from governments that have concluded the American-led system's reliability has been fatally compromised. The multipolar world that the Western analytical community has been describing as a distant eventuality is not arriving gradually. It is being constructed one Iranian operational demonstration at a time in the rubble of Western planning assumptions that proved less durable than the institutions that built them were willing to acknowledge. I want to close tonight's analysis the way this channel has always closed, the analysis that matters most, not with a clean summary, not with managed language designed to make catastrophic events sound like manageable situations, with honesty. At 1:55 this morning, 1,600 Zolfaghar missiles began arriving at the IDF Southern Command in 6 sequenced echelons, whose operational sophistication I have not seen matched in years of studying Iranian military development. At 2:25 this morning, 30 minutes later, the Southern Command was gone. And at 2:31 this morning, Washington convened an emergency session. That sequence tells you everything you need to know about where American power actually stands tonight, not where official statements say it stands, not where alliance commitments imply it stands, where it actually stands. An emergency session is what institutions convene when every framework they possess for producing a viable response has failed simultaneously. That is what happened in Washington at 2:31 this morning. And every government watching from every capital on earth has read that moment with exactly the clarity it deserves. The Zolfaghar did not just erase a military headquarters tonight, it erased another layer of the assumption that underwrites every American alliance to commitment on the planet. That assumption does not rebuild itself through diplomatic statements. It does not rebuild itself through emergency sessions. It rebuilds only through demonstrated action. And demonstrated action is precisely what Washington has been unable to produce at every critical moment in this conflict. I do not have comfortable conclusions tonight. What I have is the commitment to keep following the evidence honestly, regardless of where it leads. If tonight's analysis gave you something the mainstream coverage did not, share this video right now across every platform you use. Hit like, subscribe to US Watch Truth, and get into the comments with your honest, strategic assessment. One question. In a world where Washington's answer to the erasure of an ally's command headquarters is an emergency session, what is the American alliance system actually worth? Leave your answer below. I will be here for every chapter that follows. Stay locked in.